You know what's worse than buying a modified car? Buying one that's been modified that looks like a discount fireworks display. Plenty of flash, but it's all about to blow up. We've got a C7 Z06 that a customer brought into the shop with what sounded like a simple request. Put it back to stock. Now you see, he had just brought it out about 3 months prior and had been driving it around towards the end of the season, it being winter here, but he was getting ready to put it away, realizing he wasn't happy with how it was running and figures factory specs are the answer. But something about this isn't adding up. Why would anyone want to strip thousands in performance parts from a track-driven Z06 with such a interesting history? There's a mystery here waiting to be unraveled. Maybe it's just a poorly executed build, or maybe we're about to uncover something more deliberate. Either way, we're going to find out what's really going on with this Corvette. But before we dive in, if you enjoy automotive detective work and uncovering shady builds, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and ring that bell. We've got plenty more mysteries coming your way. Drop a comment below with your predictions. What do you think we're going to find under all these modifications? Let's get into it and see what this Z06 is hiding. This 2019 Z06 C7 Corvette came into us with a very odd request from the customer. Now you see, he had just bought it about 3 months prior and had been driving it around towards the end of the season, it being winter here. And he was getting ready to put it away, realizing he really wasn't happy with how it was running. Now, he bought this car modded up, headers, pulley, tune, and basically it just wasn't running the way that he wanted it to run. And he assumed that one of the mods that was also on there was the cause. The car had a bigger camshaft in it, but he didn't have exacts on exactly what this car had. It was unclear what the history was. Maybe it was an auction car, maybe it was something along those lines. But he had gotten it for a good deal. It had some history of possibly a track accident, something that happened that was off of its history, but clearly done from the paint and from other things that were going on. And typically, when we get these sort of requests where a customer is looking to have his car brought back to stock, it's usually because they're trying to hold the value on something, demod it to keep the value in the car. But being that this car had the track history, had some history of harder driving, the paint didn't look quite right. Great deal for a great performance car, but it's not a car that you'd be trying to keep the value on by demodding it. So when he asked us, hey, I want to bring this back to stock, we kind of were wondering what was up. Now, before we ever start, we need to get into our inspection process, which is a very big multi-point inspection process where we look at the car kind of universally no matter how the car comes in. If we're doing an oil change, we're looking at it the same way. Very rarely do we not inspect a car that comes in here unless it's for a very specific item and it's very clear to the customer that we're not looking at it. And the reason we do this is safety. Now, if we have something where we're modifying something, we're doing something else, and we didn't look at another system that could potentially fail or fails later on, who does the customer blame? They always blame the last place it was at. So we do this out of more or less just covering our own butts. We want to make sure that whatever we're recommending in an inspection is prioritized in a way that if a customer came in with something that they really wanted to do and there's a safety concern, their money might be better spent taking care of that safety concern than adding a performance part or something along those lines. So we always make sure that we're very thorough in our inspection process, and that's exactly what we started with. Now, the car had various fault codes stored in the PCM of the engine, and right away we noticed that it wasn't running quite right. Now, it had been running this way since he got it, and because it was so modded up, he assumed that the check engine light was on because of the mods. Typically, if your tuner's good and your mod shop's good, you really shouldn't run a check engine light. That's not something you should have to live with. Usually those systems should be taken care of in a very cohesive manner. And usually if there's a check engine light because of it, that's a shop that really wasn't prioritizing those things, or you mixed and matched places that you went, parts with what you went with your plan. And what ends up happening is you may have a light that wasn't accounted for, where a proper build would actually take those into account and put the measures in place to be able to handle the mods that are being added to the car. So a check engine light isn't something that you should have to live with, but right away we had pressure faults inside of the PCM relating to the supercharger, relating to airflow. Now these cars are both map-based and pressure-based, so they do work off those two systems. But right away we noticed that this little guy here on the inlet for the throttle before the supercharger had a huge air leak, massive air leak, just leaking tons of air. Now, honestly, that was probably enough to cause the sort of running issues that he was complaining about, which still made us wonder, like, should we really be putting this thing back to stock? Maybe all you need, instead of buying a stock camshaft, doing all the labor to put that back in, taking the headers off, I mean, you could potentially be spending tens of thousands of dollars when in reality, you just have a few things that need a small tweak. Now that's an easy one. That one we wouldn't even have to do a tune or anything else along those lines. So that right away we noted. And the other thing that we were curious about is if it had been running like that for so long, what about the spark plugs? What had happened to them? Was it running lean? Were they burnt out? Was there other issues? So we recommended, let's get that hose fixed. Let's get the spark plugs pulled. Let's read them, see what's going on before we recommend any demodding and see how the car runs. So after we finished the recommended repairs, we pulled the spark plugs and noticed that the gap was a bit bigger than you'd want on a performance modified boosted vehicle. The gaps are over 32 thousandths, which as a rule of thumb, when we have a boosted car here, they're always under 28 thousandths, just to make sure that we're not going to run into blowout issues on the spark plugs, that they'll be able to ionize the gap and have a complete combustion process. As the bigger you get that gap, the more cylinder pressure will blow that gap out, especially if you're adding boost with a smaller pulley, and that can create misfire problems. So the plugs actually looked pretty good. It had brisk racing spark plugs in there, but they looked a little worn and the gaps needed to be closed up. So we cleaned them off, closed the gaps up, and this thing was running decent. I say decent because deep down in there, driving it around, the tune was still a little funky. I could tell that this car had been tuned, but it was just a bit sloppy. And that's really the best word I can use for it. Sloppy being when you came to a stop, it would want to dip. The idle would be a little funny. Now that could be a direct result of the camshaft. However, we don't know what camshaft was in here. We could try tracing it back. Now it's pretty safe to say that if we had spark plugs present that weren't gapped properly, and we had a massive air leak that more or less looked like an oversight, that there was probably some other mods that weren't done with the best of thought put behind them. And the tune is always just one of those that, probably falls in line. We could see inside of the tune that it had been modified, but it was hard to say if that was really dialed in for this cam. So being that we had this thing much closer, we felt it was safe at that point, after all of the mechanical work was corrected to get this thing running better, that we could then go in for the tune. And that's kind of where we're at now. So what we're going to do is we're going to hook this car up to the dyno. We're going to see where it's at, how much power it's putting out. And I'm not really approaching this as how much more power can I get out of this tune. It's how much more drivability can I get back for this customer. It just feels funky. Even in light throttle areas, I could feel a slight surge. I feel a little bit more popping under light load than I should feel. And it just makes me wonder, where's this thing at? What's going on with it? And I bet we can sharpen that up in the tune. Will we get more power out of it? Hard to say, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is, can we get this thing to run better for the customer, where he thought he was going to come in and spend tens of thousands of dollars putting this thing back to stock. And we more or less clean his spark plugs, fix a hose, retune this thing, dial it in for the mods on our dyno, custom tune it, and get this thing running the way he always expected it to be when he bought the car. Let's see if we can accomplish that. Corvettes in general are generally a pain in the ass to dyno. They're very light in the rear end and they make a ton of torque. They want to climb off the dyno, and the newer models have less exposed suspension parts, especially with all these diffuser add-ons on here for me to be able to get to. So they just tend to be very time consuming to strap down, because strapping a car down is kind of a balancing act. You need to strap it down tight enough where it doesn't come off, but loose enough where it can climb the rollers a little bit. And it's just always a game of how tight versus how loose and how secure and how safe. And, you know, even though I've done a fair amount of these, when people add this stuff, it just gets more difficult. So I'm probably going to spend maybe 20 minutes getting this thing down here, but it's just part of the job. All right, I've got the car on the dyno. I've got my HP Tuners scanner hooked up. Going to be running the car, seeing the log. I got my PID set up, and we're going to see how the car reacts with just the tune that's on here. And then we're going to go in and see if there's any changes that can be made if we see the car running any way funky at all. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but I have a feeling we'll at least get this thing a little bit smoother on the low end. But let's get going on that. All right, so that's a bit of a surprise. Now, when I had the car in the street, I did not feel any sort of breakup, but it was colder out. I really wasn't trying to beat on it. The dyno definitely puts a higher load on the car, so we need to go into the file, see what the log saw, and try to figure out what that breakup was, but I wasn't expecting to have that in the first run, but let's see what we can see. All right, so already I can see that the torque tables, which limit the torque for power, really aren't dialed in the way that I would expect to see a car with this many mods. So the throttle's already being closed because of the response to the output sensed by the car and the tables. So I know if we just take those out, we should be able to find power. Now, I work really well hand in hand with a company that I've been good friends with over the years, Mideast Performance Tuning, gentleman by the name of Bader. You've probably seen him in some of our other videos. Typically, when I do an American car or anything HP Tuners, he is a pro, an expert, works very well remotely, and he's kind of been my go-to for all this stuff. Now, a lot of it I do know, but when you have somebody who does this stuff in and out all day long and knows these definitions and knows this, where to find the information, for us, as far as a time management point of view, it's just better to have somebody who knows what they're doing get in there and let us know what's going on. And already he's seeing some areas that could use a lot of correction, and he thinks we probably could add a bunch of horsepower to this car, but we got to figure out what that breakout is, and we're looking at that right now. Now, my guess is this car is probably just under 600 horsepower. Hard to say though, but what we were doing here is we were on our way, and this is exactly where I started feeling the dip. And as you can see, power dipped down. I jumped out of it because I wasn't sure what exactly was going on. But a big telltale sign here is that the dyno air fuel meter saw it start going rich, and it pegged rich. Now, my dyno maxes out at about 10:2 air to fuel ratio. So this is the very most it could go. It could be richer than that, but that's the lowest it'll read. And as you can see, we dipped down. So my guess is maybe we're getting a high fueling request inside of the ECU or fuel delivery that isn't quite right. So we're going to compare this log to that log, but we should be able to swing this out quite a bit more, hopefully get near to that 550 wheel horsepower number. That would be excellent, but we'll have to see. So there's a few goofy things inside of here, especially with how they're running the torque management. The fuel definitely is doing something at that point. The smart thing here might be to just go back to stock in those specific tables and see how it runs. with stock settings on there and then kind of tune from there as opposed to trying to tune over somebody else's settings. So I believe that's what we're going to do. We're going to take off all of the torque limiting, and that should make power on its own, since there was some torque limiting left in there, which isn't usually very typical on a modified car to this level. So we're going to do that. We're going to adjust that, run it right now, and see what it turns out to be. What's really weird is there's a lot of areas with a lot of negative timing that I wouldn't expect to see. Not 100% sure why they would have it that way, but kind of a head scratcher. All right, so we got a couple of runs in, and I'm seeing something pretty interesting here. Now, when I started off this video, I assumed that this would be a quick, let's tune this car out. We thought it might be a mechanical issue and it needed a slight tweak, because the car felt okay on the road. I will say I've driven a lot of Z06 C7s, and it felt about average for one. Not really modded up the way it should with that camshaft and pulley in there, but the problem being is it was cold out and I really didn't want to get on it with these tires and everything else. So it was hard to really experience what it exactly was doing. However, I'm starting to wonder, based off the logs that we're seeing, if there's something a little bit more going on here behind the scenes. Now, this car is direct injection, and therefore it has a high pressure fuel system where the pressures get quite high in order to inject the fuel into the cylinder. So on these cars, we probably should be seeing around 20 MPa, give or take a little bit. But what we're seeing at this breakup point here, and I didn't notice it as much before because it's slightly dipped, but I did find it odd that there were so many torque controls on there and so much timing pulled from a supposedly tuned car. Now, when we removed those and went back to stock settings, which it should be able to handle, there's no reason why this car couldn't handle at least stock for the pulley that's on there and the headers. Maybe you might take out a degree of timing for the pulley, but honestly, not usually what we see. All right, now check this out. You'll see that as we're getting up to that breakup point, fuel pressure will drop to 9 in that range before popping back up to the 18 that it should be at. Also, if you look there, the low pressure fuel rail drops by about 2 or 3 psi, but not where we typically see a fault with fuel in that area, where it should drop by 10 to 15 psi if it was having a delivery issue with the actual low pressure fuel system. I think there's something going on with this high pressure fuel pump. Now, this car has a camshaft, like I said, and it's hard to know if there's something that was maybe installed incorrectly, because the high pressure fuel pump is driven off the camshaft, or if possibly something wore down, or was this something that they knew about? And I'd hate to even say this, but is this something they knew about and detuned the car before they sold it, keeping all those torque limits on, pulling timing from this car, so that way all it would do is dip a little bit and not really, because some of those values that were in there, us just removing them might have made an additional 80, 90 horsepower. And it was very odd seeing it on there. So I'm almost wondering if someone knew this thing was starting to have issues and pulled it so that way it would feel nice and smooth when you went out to drive it, but not what this car should be doing with these mods. Now, the unfortunate part about all this is that the high pressure fuel pump, in order for us to inspect it, it's underneath the supercharger, meaning we're going to have to pull the supercharger to see what's going on. So based off of this information and what I'm seeing on these dyno graphs, I think that's what we're going to have to do. But the good news is that once we get this pressure sorted out, I think there's potentially over 100 horsepower left to be had on this vehicle. And I think that's going to make the customer happy as long as we can figure it out. All right, Taylor, so this car, apparently from what the customer said, he's not sure of all the mods, but he's pretty sure it had a camshaft installed in it, headers, and a smaller pulley. So The tune was actually really sloppy, and I'm almost wondering if either this car was like really, really detuned for nitrous, or if they were trying to keep this problem that we were having tuning on there, which was when we started commanding more fuel, you could see the fuel pump would run out of fuel. Like you'd ask for more fuel and the rail pressure would drop in the direct injection system. So typically when I see that, it means that there's something going on with the high pressure fuel pump, but being that these are camshaft driven, I don't know what the piece they put sometimes some of the cams have pieces that they put inside there to drive the pump. So like, was that put in right? Did something happen to it? There's a lot of questions there. So what I was told was, if we get the supercharger off, get it to the side, take the high pressure fuel pump off, we should be able to see at least down into the cam lobe to see if something's going on with the cam, to see that follower that's in there, or to see if maybe something's wrong with the high pressure fuel pump itself.
Yeah.
So that's really what you're going to be doing, getting this blower off so that way we can do that inspection and see what's going on in there. So let me know what you find, but have at it.
For sure. Sounds good.
All right, so this is the high pressure pump, and you can see we've got it out here. Now what we're looking for is damage on the piston or spring, which this one's looking okay. Not really seeing any issues going on with it, which is kind of a bummer. You're always hoping for a smoking gun, but I have seen issues with these valves. Some of them get dirty. However, even if it did get dirty, because of the location of this thing, there has been some people that have success with pulling these out and then pulsing these in like an ultrasonic bath, trying to clean these out and then putting them back together. The problem with that as a professional shop is if it doesn't work and we put this back together, we're on the hook for pulling it back apart and doing that repair again. So more than likely, unless we see something further wrong with this, we're probably just going to recommend a replacement. It's real hard to tell if you don't see any physical damage, if these things are potentially starting to fail or not, or something further internal. And it's not something you really want to pull apart because there isn't really much we can do about it to fix it from a point of view where we would want to warranty it. On my own car, yeah, I might try it. I might see what's in there, replaceable, DIY. But if it's something that we've got to put a warranty behind and tell the person that, you're not going to have any issues, 6 months, a year from now, we're probably going to go with a OE replacement pump. The other aspect of this, and what I was worried about, is we are looking for any camshaft wear. Now we've got the valley tray off here, and we can see into the valley. What we're after here is this little piston, this guy here, and I want to make sure that the roller down there isn't damaged. The journal there, this little guy is going to come off. We're going to get that guy out, and we're going to go ahead and see what's going on with it. So I don't really see anything that's too concerning. A little bit of wear here and a little bit of wear on the lifter piston bore here, but nothing that looks like it is the sign of like anything serious. Probably want to take a look at that camshaft journal, and I can't quite jump up there, but what I will do is stick a mirror down there, see if I can see anything going on. But was hoping for something that would tell us that this thing had failed visually. It's always frustrating because while these pumps do fail, and most high pressure fuel pumps do fail kind of in a similar way, you always kind of want to see something that is visually indicative of the failure, so that way you know what you're putting in there is going to cause the issue, especially when there's this much work involved, pulling the supercharger, getting all this stuff off, and having that guy be underneath there, because if it doesn't fix it, you got to pull it back off and switch it out. And these things are kind of difficult to test in the sense without accessing them, which means you're doing the work anyway. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at that camshaft, because we do know, or we were told, that this thing has a camshaft in it, and being that this is directly driven off the camshaft, it could have something to do with that, but it also could just be this guy getting tired. All right, Taylor rolled over the camshaft and took a look at it. Didn't really find anything that looks concerning, so that kind of puts us in a precarious situation where we're more or less just gonna have to toss a fuel pump at it and see what happens. Again, are there ways to pull this valve out, and ultrasonic clean it and do all this other stuff. That's fine for your DIY if you're trying to save a buck, but for a shop that has to stand behind it, we know that high pressure fuel delivery is not meeting what it needs to, not meeting what it's commanding for the amount of power that we're hitting. We're seeing a drop, so we're gonna toss a fuel pump in. We don't see any issues with the cams. We'll check the shim height, the lash adjustment of the cam when we go back in, make sure that's good. It looked good before, but we'll double check it going back in now that we're actually putting it back on. And if all's said and done, we're basically gonna get it back on the dyno and hopefully we'll see an increase in fuel pressure. All right, so finally the car's back on the dyno and we're gonna be able to see if that fuel pump was the culprit of what was causing this thing to have running issues, dropping fuel pressure according to our logs. Now, we didn't see anything smoking gun-wise when we pulled that pump out, but we don't have any other explanation since the low pressure system was pumping up fuel and the request was dropping pressure at the rail. We just didn't see what else could be going on. It's very difficult to measure rail pressure manually, but according to the sensors, it looked like it was dropping pretty significantly. So we replaced the fuel pump and we're going back to the dyno. We're gonna try tuning it. I've got Bader here hooked in from Kuwait from Mideast Performance, and we're about to see if the changes we made actually equate to getting this car fixed and hitting the numbers that we're supposed to be hitting. All right, this is good news. Just did a run, and even though I couldn't keep the rollers from spinning the tires, what we see in the logs is that the fuel pressure is actually staying at the 19 to 20 millipascals that we're looking for all the way through the run, which was dropping before. So this is double good because we're gonna be able to continue to do this, but it also means my diagnostic was right. I always hate when we get in there and don't see a smoking gun problem, but it doesn't mean that something internally hadn't failed. And putting that fuel pump on has resolved that issue, which means we could actually go back to tuning, which was the first focus. We didn't think we had a mechanical issue, but tuning brought that out. Now we're gonna be able to actually get in here and see what's going on, but I was not prepared for how much torque this thing is making. It actually spun the tires all the way through, so I've got to figure out how to load this car up so I can get a clean run and make sure I've got everything strapped down correctly to keep it from rolling up on the dyno. It's always a balancing game when you're messing with the dyno, but really good news. I'm super excited. We're going to continue on with the tuning. We're going to see what we can get out of this car and see if we can get it back to the customer. So we're nearing the end, and in some of our tuning, we found that the throttle is closing towards the top end. So we threw the choice up to the customer because we believe that the TCU is actually in charge of shutting that throttle down towards the top end to kind of limit some of the power. And we felt like if we went further and did a TCU tune, we'd be able to keep that throttle open because we were watching it close down towards the end of the run. However, the customer said, hey, so far I like what you're doing. I don't think I really need it right now. And he opted out of it based on price, more or less. But that being said, we're getting close to trying to complete a full final run. Up until this point, we've just been logging, watching, going through, but we're going to see the final numbers. This thing's cooled down, and we're going to see what this thing puts out versus what it came in with. 589 wheel horsepower is the final number. We've got the original graph, and this is right where we saw the fuel starting to dip, and you can see here it coming back down. We actually, at this point, right about 5,500, I shut it down because it was pulling so much fuel, getting lean, but you can see how we can carry over the horsepower, and I mean, that's almost 130 horsepower gain. And the customer noticed a whole bunch of problems when he came in. Really didn't say it felt like it didn't have power, but he was saying he didn't like the way it idled, didn't like the way it drove. It just felt off to him. I think we're going to get a lot of that drivability back because he did have an issue he was dealing with, but also the tune was kind of just out of whack. Really wasn't working with the car. And I don't know if they maybe tried tuning on top of that fuel pump and that caused the issue. But with that said, these gains are pretty massive, not typical, not what I would have expected had we not done the tune. I think this is indicative of a problem and the car needing a tune, both at the same time. So we really don't have apples to apples to compare here. However, it shows you how when doing a tune, you can find an issue and help correct a problem for the customer that they might not have been aware it had. The customer might have just been driving this out thinking, oh, wow, this car feels pretty good. You know, I know it's modified, but I'm not, you know, sure exactly, because typically a C7 Z06 on our dyno will put down in the 430 range. So this was a little disappointing for those cars. I mean, again, we were falling off when we shut it down. So, you know, it might have continued to hold out there had it not had the fuel pump issue. But, you know, still we'd be peaking right about 450. So you got to think with headers and a long tube, that's a little bit of a disappointing number. Really what we did was just take advantage of those things that were on the car, optimized it for the new fuel pump, and the rest is history. So there is probably a little bit of gains over what this car should have been making. However, just dialing it in, really knowing what's going on, watching it, logging it, seeing that it's not just about the tune. In this case, there was a mechanical issue. We were able to figure it out for the customer, and this should feel great for him to be able to get some peace and closure on this car purchase. All right, it is the middle of a polar vortex here in the Chicagoland area. I got the dashboard showing 16 degrees. These tires are rated for probably about 45 degrees. So I'm taking this thing out mostly just to make sure that we don't have any issues in areas that you drive this in. The last thing we'd want is a customer picking up the car, driving this thing home, and having something pop up on the way back. So I'm not gonna be getting into it. I might roll into it a little bit just to feel it, but I'm not taking chances with somebody else's car on a day that you shouldn't really be driving these cars. But that being said, I do know moving it around the shop, this thing was lumping and chopping, and it was almost hard to move in and out of the shop. Just even at light throttle, things are bouncing everywhere. And now there's still some chop to this thing. You could definitely hear it chopping outside, and that's the camshaft, but you can properly tune that thing so that way you have some drivability, unless it's just the craziest cam. Even then though, you'd be surprised what you could do with a comparable tune to get it correct, to get that low range where you're pulling out to be somewhat responsive. Not always, but there's a lot more than you think you can do, and it's usually in the tune, but this is mostly just a quick shakedown. Make sure that I'm not giving the customer back with anything that I didn't take for a ride myself. Let's get on it a little bit here. Ooh, it's touchy. Yeah, definitely had some wheel slip there. That was probably just over a third throttle as well. This thing wants to move, and I'm not gonna let it today, but that felt smooth. It felt solid when I was laying into it. No cuts, no chops. I'd really like to give this thing a shakedown just to make sure that it's reacting the way it was in the dyno, but unfortunately you kind of got to deal with what Mother Nature throws at you sometimes. But this thing is much more drivable than when it came in, I can tell you that much. I can understand why the customer was so apprehensive about bringing it back to stock. It just was not driving well at all. And it's really hard to say because that tune was just kind of all over the place. But was it more the tune or was it more the fuel pump? Probably a combination of both, to be honest. But being that this thing had so much timing pulled out of it from where we eventually ended up being, you know, it's hard for me to say that this thing wasn't somehow, some way detuned, being that if you were going to put these mods in the car, you'd kind of want to take advantage of all of it. And the car did have a tune on it. I mean, you could see that the file was modified over the base stock map. And as to why that was done in that way is anybody's guess. maybe it was a last second thing, draw everything back, just get this thing out of here. Or maybe they didn't know, maybe they didn't understand why the car was reacting the way it is, and they just kept adjusting the fuel till it kind of responded, because we were still getting full power runs on the dyno, nothing cut out, nothing chopped. It's just we saw fuel pressure drop, and that led us to believe that, hey, if this is happening, we better shut it down before something goes on. But in all honesty, the car drove, it felt powerful, and if you didn't know Z06s, you might be thinking that, oh, this is fast enough. But all in all, I'd say this thing's much improved, and I think the customer is going to be thrilled with it. This Z06 was a masterclass in shady shortcuts and why gut instincts matter. The owner was ready to throw down tens of thousands to return it to stock, but all it really needed was a proper diagnosis and execution. Now, while we can't confirm for certain, we suspect the previous shop tried to hide a dying fuel pump by aggressively detuning what should have been a 589 wheel horsepower missile into something that struggled to outrun even a base model Z06, even with all the mods. Lesson 1, if it feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your gut. And lesson 2, diagnosing cars isn't magic, it's a process. What started as a simple tune revealed itself to be a mechanical issue only because we took the time to analyze the data and follow the evidence. In the end, we didn't just fix the car, we transformed it into what it should have been all along. Now, if you found value in today's detective work, make sure you're subscribed to catch more diagnostic deep dives like this one. And if you enjoyed watching us solve this puzzle and bring the Z06 back from the brink, hit the like button. It helps more than you know. Now, share your story in the comments. What's the most creative modification discovery on your car that you didn't do? Now, I'm talking custom engineering that would make NASA engineers weep. Let's hear your tales of automotive innovations gone wrong. Until next time, keep it fast, keep it smart, and as always, stay loud, stay curious, and we'll catch you in the next one.